For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe.
Sardinia is often described as isolated, but that's only half true. Yes, it's an island, but it sits at the center of the Western Mediterranean, positioned between the Italian peninsula, Iberia, and North Africa, with easy access to the Eastern Mediterranean world. That meant Sardinia was never cut off. Nevertheless, it remained politically independent for most of its early history. The Nuragic culture begins to emerge around 1800 BCE in the Middle Bronze Age. To give you context, this is when Mycenaean palaces dominated parts of Greece, and Egypt was nearing the end of its Middle Kingdom. On Sardinia, we have the appearance of the first nuraghi, stone towers unlike anything else in that part of the world. They command valleys, coastlines, and routes of movement. They often interlock visually, one tower visible from the next. Initially, they were relatively simple, single structures with a central chamber, but over time they became more complex. Some grew taller, others expanded outward into multi-tower complexes with bastions, courtyards, wells, and surrounding villages. Despite shaping an entire island for over 1,000 years, the Nuragic civilization is barely mentioned in most history textbooks. So let's correct that a bit today. I want to tell you about this fascinating culture, and to understand who these people really were, we have to step inside those towers. The heart of a nuraghi is its corbelled chamber. Stone courses project inward, layer by layer, until they close into a domed space, what archaeologists often call a tholos, meaning dome in Greek, even though this technique developed independently here. There is no mortar, just carefully balanced stone held together by mass, friction, and accuracy. In some towers, these chambers are stacked, one above another, creating vertical interior spaces that require internal staircases. And the staircases are built inside the thickness of the wall itself. It means the builders weren't improvising. They were planning vertically from the moment the first stones were laid. Lighting, too, is intentional. Narrow slits and openings allow controlled light into the chamber. Some nuraghi are modest in size, single towers maybe 30 feet high. Others, like nuraghi Santo Antine, rise much higher and incorporate multiple chambers, corridors, and secondary towers. Imagine walking through this, huh? Branching corridors, stairways spiraling upwards, chambers opening and closing around you. And all this was built during the Bronze Age. No iron tools. No written plans as far as we can see. Was there even a centralized state bureaucracy? This knowledge had to be passed down from generation to generation because nuraghi weren't built once and forgotten. They were part of a long architectural tradition. That refinement is especially clear at complex sites like Su Nuraghi di Barumini. Here the original central tower was later surrounded by a 4-tower bastion, then an outer wall, then a dense village of circular huts. This place had centuries of modification. And this brings us to the question everyone asks. What were these towers for? For a long time, scholars leaned heavily toward defense. Thick walls, elevated positions, narrow entranceways. It seems to fit. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why so many nuraghi are built within sight of one another. It doesn't explain why some towers were expanded long after their defensive value had diminished. And it doesn't explain why, in later periods, certain nuraghi appear to take on symbolic roles. The most convincing explanation is also the least satisfying for people who want a single answer. Nuraghi were many things. They likely began as elite residences and power centers. Over time, some became communal hubs. Then they became symbols of identity or memory. And in certain cases, they may have become spaces for ceremonies. At sites like Nuraghi Palmavera, you can actually watch this process unfold. There was a main limestone tower built in the 14th century BCE, and it had some huts surrounding it. It was reinforced with sandstone in the early 9th century, when a second tower also was built, and the village around it expanded. And there was a third remodeling a short time later. It's interesting that people lived beside the nuraghi. That means the nuraghi were not monuments meant to be admired from a distance, they were meant to be entered, climbed, and maintained. If the nuraghi tell us how the Nuragic people built, their villages tell us how they lived. Because the towers didn't stand alone. Around many nuraghi grew clusters of circular stone huts, forming villages that could range from a handful of dwellings to sprawling communities with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of structures. Each hut was typically built with stone foundations, and the superstructures likely supported wooden roofs. Inside, space was organized carefully. Hearths, storage areas, benches, and work zones all appear repeatedly across the sites. The spaces were rebuilt and reused over generations. The tower dominated the village physically, but it was also surrounded by it. People moved between huts and towers constantly, blurring the line between elite space and communal space. Some villages show signs of specialization, huts likely used for storage, others for craft production, and in certain cases, large circular structures interpreted as assembly huts. Yeah, but these larger huts often contained stone benches running along the interior walls, suggesting places where groups gathered, sat, and deliberated. This hints at collective decision-making, or at least shared ritual or social practices, not simply rule by a single warlord behind stone walls. The Nuragic world appears to have been hierarchical, but not rigidly centralized. There are elites. There are symbols of authority, but no palaces, no royal tombs, no written proclamations. Instead, authority seems to have been negotiated and grounded in control of the land, access to resources, and visibility. Nowhere is this clearer than at Serra Orios. Serra Orios is not dominated by a single massive tower. Instead, it's a large village composed of dozens of huts interwoven with formal ritual spaces, including rectangular Megaron-style temples set within sacred precincts. Here, domestic life and ritual life were inseparable. This challenges a common assumption that Nuragic religion must have been secretive or confined to isolated monuments. Taken together, villages, assembly spaces, ritual areas, and symbolic objects, we begin to see a society that was deeply place-based. Power flowed through land and architecture. And speaking of the land, water shaped the sacred geography of this culture. Because alongside towers and villages, the Nuragic people built something very different. These are the Nuragic sacred wells. By the Iron Age, the Nuragic world is no longer building upward at the same pace, but it is still investing in places. They built downward. At first glance, they can be easy to miss. They don't rise above the landscape. They descend into it. Stone staircases lead downward into carefully constructed underground chambers, where light fades, the sound softens, and attention narrows. One of the most striking examples is Su Tempiesu. A stepped passage leads down toward a spring, enclosed within finely cut stone walls. The masonry is unusually precise, far more refined than what we see in many domestic contexts. Don't think of this merely as a utilitarian well, a place to fetch water. It was a designed ritual space. Water emerges from the earth at the end of a controlled ceremonial approach. You're guided toward it. The Nuragic sacred wells suggest a belief system in which water itself carried meaning, perhaps as a source of renewal, legitimacy, or divine presence. Because in many ancient societies, wells and springs are considered a boundary between us here on the surface and the underworld, between human control and natural power. Sites like Su Tempiesu appear to originate in the late Bronze Age, but evidence suggests they continued to be used into the Iron Age. It tells us something about the transformation of Nuragic religion. As tower construction slowed, ritual architecture became more prominent. Attention shifted from monumentality above ground to controlled sacred experience below ground. Across Sardinia, archaeologists have identified multiple well temples and water sanctuaries, often associated with Nuragic settlements, but spatially distinct from the domestic areas. That separation is telling. It suggests ritual activity that required movement away from everyday space, controlled access, and the development of sacred rules. The descent into a sacred well slows you down. It narrows your vision. It brings you physically closer to the source of life in a dry Mediterranean landscape. And once you see that, it becomes clear that Nuragic architecture was about the experience. This helps explain why some nuraghi themselves, which originally had more of a functional purpose, appear to take on ritual roles in later periods. Once a structure accumulates generations of memory, Once it becomes the place where decisions were made, gatherings were held, and ancestors lived, it doesn't stop being powerful when its original function changes. It becomes sacred through use. Up to this point, I've told you about where they lived and what they built, but the Nuragic people did something else for us. They show us themselves. Kind of. One of the most direct windows into Nuragic identity comes from the small bronze figurines known as Bronzetti. These are finely cast objects made using the lost wax technique, and they appear across Sardinia, often deposited in ritual contexts. They depict warriors with horned helmets and round shields, archers and spearmen, animals, boats with raised prows, figures standing upright, deliberately posed, not caught in motion, but presented. They are carefully composed images repeating many of the same symbols. The weapons mean something. The armor means something. Their posture means something. They were statements. Statements about how the Nuragic people saw themselves, about the importance of warfare, seafaring, community, and status, and about which roles were worth commemorating in metal. What's interesting is how consistent these depictions are across the island. This suggests shared values, shared symbols, a cultural identity strong enough to persist across regions without centralized state enforcing it. The figurines tell us that identity, especially elite and warrior identity, was something to be displayed, standardized, and remembered. And then, from sometime in the early Iron Age, something extraordinary turned up. On the western coast of Sardinia, near the Sinis Peninsula, fragments of massive stone sculptures were discovered. These fragments come from Monte Pramma. When reconstructed, they reveal towering human figures, some over 2 meters tall, carved in stone. They depict warriors, archers, and boxers. Their eyes are rendered as concentric circles, staring outward. Their bodies are stylized, rigid, formal. Clearly, these are not naturalistic portraits. They're probably best described as monuments. What makes this discovery so important is not just the scale of the statues, but what they represent. Until Monte Pramma, the Nuragic world was known for towers, villages, and small bronzes, but not for monumental figurative sculpture. And suddenly, here they are. Dozens of large stone figures. They are difficult to interpret. Some believe they are beetles, standing stones set within a funerary or commemorative context. They're probably not individualized kings. They're more likely types. Nuragic society appears to value roles over rulers, and then, just as abruptly as they appear, the statues were broken and buried. Why? Conflict? Ritual closure? Political change? We don't really know. What happened to the Nuragic civilization? We tend to expect ancient states to end dramatically, suddenly, with a clear, final chapter, but that's not what happened here. By the early Iron Age, Sardinia became increasingly connected to wider Mediterranean networks. Phoenician traders arrived. New materials, goods, and ideas circulated here. But the Nuragic world didn't simply vanish. The towers remained standing. Villages continued to be occupied. Sacred places, especially the wells and long-used ritual sites, retained their importance. What changed is how these spaces were used. They were reused and became landmarks of memory. This tells us that the Nuragic civilization wasn't wiped away by outsiders. It was absorbed into a changing world, carrying its architecture, symbols, and sense of place with it. The Nuragic people never disappeared from Sardinia. They became Sardinians, and their towers remain embedded in the land, shaping how every later culture understands the island. Yes, you can still walk into these towers. I want to walk into them. You can stand inside spaces built nearly 4,000 years ago and feel how carefully they were planned, see how the light moves, listen to how the sound carries, feel what it was like back then. This is a civilization best understood in place, which is why I want to end this episode by saying something a little unusual for ancient mysteries. If this story intrigued you, if you've ever wanted to move beyond images and reconstructions and actually experience an ancient world, I'll be exploring these Nuragic sites in person, and I'm inviting you to come with me. This will be a major part of my upcoming Italy and Sardinia Antiquity tour. We won't just be visiting the Nuraghi, we'll be unpacking what we know and what we don't know, and how archaeologists actually interpret these places. we'll be exploring the very places I've been telling you about. These are sites where time on site matters. Context tells you more than any video can. Sometimes the past doesn't reveal itself in words, but in the experience of being there. If this episode sparked something for you, check out the details linked below. It's a small group, and these are places where time on site really matters. And whether you join the tour or simply keep exploring through episodes like this, I hope one thing is clear. The Nuragic civilization isn't mysterious merely because of unanswered questions. It's mysterious because it's something very different from what we're accustomed to. And sometimes the past doesn't need to explain itself in writing. It just needs to be stood inside.
You might like my little e-booklet, Why Ancient History Matters. It's designed to persuade people that the subject is important, even in the modern world. You might also wish to use it to help spread the word. So feel free to share it with someone you know. It's free for anyone who wants it. I've left a link in the description box below the video for you to grab a copy. Catch you later.